you have your second cup?
Yeah, you could have the rest.
So, hello everyone. I am Shesmin, your MC for today. So, thank you for joining us in today's dialogue on assessing the prospects of war and peace in the Taiwan Strait. The forum is organized by World Scientific Publishing. Moving on to the next slide. Now for a few housekeeping notes before we start. So you are most welcome to leave your camera on, but please keep the mics muted while the forum is ongoing. There will be a Q&A session after the talk, so please feel free to post your questions in the chat at any time. After posting your question in the chat, you may be invited to unmute and read it out during the Q&A session if you are comfortable in doing so. Also, this webinar will be recorded and posted online. Moving on to the next slide. So today we are honoured to welcome Scott Kastner, a distinguished scholar renowned for his expertise on the international dynamics of East Asia. Joining us as our special guest for today's forum, Professor Kastner will guide our discussion through the intricate landscape surrounding the potential for military conflict in the Taiwan Strait. So Scott Kastner currently holds the position of Professor of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland. With a research focus on the international politics of East Asia, Professor Kastner also teaches classes on international relations, US-China relations, international political economy, and East Asian studies. Professor Kastner is also an accomplished author, having written titles such as War and Peace in the Taiwan Strait, which will be used as a framework for today's discussion, China's strategic multilateralism, investing in global governance and political conflict, and economic independence across the Taiwan Strait and beyond. Now, we are also pleased to welcome back our familiar panel of experienced co-moderators. So moving on to the next slide. The first is Professor Ji-Chun Chu, Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Bucknell University, USA. He is also a member of the National Committee on United States-China Relations, as well as an accomplished author and editor. Moving on to the next slide. Then lastly, joining us as well as co-moderator is Professor Da-Xuan Feng, Honorary Dean of Henan University Belt and Road Research Institute and the Chief Advisor of China Silk Road I-Valley Research Institute. Now, without further ado, please welcome Professor Scott Kastner to kick off the discussion and share his presentation.
Great. Thank you, Shesmin. Can you hear me okay? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. I just see, I'm already like screwing this up. Let me do you know how to get out of the whiteboard, Shesmin?
If you unshare your screen and share again, it should be able to get out of the whiteboard.
Okay, yeah, I got it. Okay, so let me try this again. So obviously we should have done this. Okay, now I see. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, sorry about that. So thank you, Shazmin, and thank you, Jurchen and Dashran, for inviting me. I really appreciate the chance to present here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about a book that I just recently published with Columbia University Press, War and Peace in the Taiwan Strait. Okay, so it wasn't that long ago that the cross-strait relationship was actually looking like it was moving in a stabilizing direction, right? So when Ma Ying-jeou was the president of Taiwan, we had this kind of period of unprecedented détente in the cross-strait relationship where we saw extensive interactions between the two sides, including increasingly high-level meetings, culminating right in this meeting between Ma and Xi Jinping in Singapore in 2015. We saw a raft of agreements reached between the two sides, including a number of significant economic agreements. This kind of process of détente, of course, came to a kind of a screeching halt in 2016 with the election of Tsai Ing-wen as Taiwan's president. Tsai, unlike Ma, was unwilling to kind of accommodate the PRC on kind of core sovereignty issues, and most notably was not willing to kind of accept in principle this idea that Taiwan should be thought of in some form as a part of China. The PRC has kind of made this kind of a basic precondition for engagement with Taiwan. And so after Tsai became president, this kind of process of détente and dialogue between the two sides kind of came to a halt. The PRC in recent years has kind of begun to really ratchet up coercive pressure on Taiwan. And we see this in a number of different domains. Of course, in economic domains, the PRC started to kind of put more pressure on Taiwan. Even before the COVID pandemic, right, we saw kind of restrictions on tourism in Taiwan that had been opened up under Ma. And so forth. Certainly, there's been a lot of diplomatic pressure. Taiwan had kind of been able to experience some more international space during the Ma administration, such as kind of being able to be an observer in the World Health Assembly, and that's kind of come to an end. And we've seen that the PRC kind of entice a number of Taiwan's diplomatic allies away over the past several years. But most notably, we've kind of seen a substantial ratcheting up in military pressure directed against Taiwan. And this military pressure has taken a number of different forms. We see it in the form of kind of a growing number of military exercises of kind of larger scale in the Taiwan Strait and in Taiwan's vicinity in recent years. We see kind of other kind of gray zone operations, kind of frequent incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, crossing of the median line by PRC military aircraft and so forth. Okay, and so this, in turn, as we've kind of seen this kind of scaling up of military pressure against Taiwan, has led in recent years to kind of a lot of concern about the prospects for military conflict in the Taiwan Strait. And you know, the Economist magazine, of course, kind of famously kind of in a cover a few years ago, kind of described the Taiwan Strait as being the most dangerous place on Earth. Arguably, this was pretty clearly hyperbole, especially in retrospect when we've kind of seen horrible conflicts break out elsewhere in the world. But certainly, it kind of captures a pretty widespread sentiment that the Taiwan Strait is a really significant flashpoint for military conflict, and we see this, for instance, this kind of sentiment being expressed by a number of high-ranking U.S. officials. So the then commander of U.S. Indo-PACOM in 2021, Philip Davidson, kind of suggested in testimony to Congress that a cross-strait conflict was something that was quite possible to happen in the next 6 years. And this is kind of a sentiment that's been echoed by others in the U.S. government, including, you see, I've put up a quote here by the Director of National Intelligence. Okay, but at the same time, even though there has been this kind of much greater attention paid to the prospects for military conflict in the Taiwan Strait, it's important to note that there is pushback against this idea that a conflict is becoming much more likely. And here I've put up a kind of a headline from three very well-known experts of cross-strait relations and Taiwan, Richard Bush, Bonnie Glaser, and Ryan Haas, basically kind of pushing back against this idea that that a military conflict in the Taiwan Strait is imminent, and kind of suggesting that to express such a view is actually something that, or kind of to suggest that military conflict is likely, is something that, if anything, is kind of what the PRC wants. Okay, and so kind of part of what motivated this book was kind of a desire to really kind of think through like how worried we should actually be about the possibility of armed conflict in the Taiwan Strait. And I think that it's part of the reason why we see such divergent views among scholars, among kind of officials concerning the risk of conflict in the Taiwan Strait, is that it's really hard to evaluate how much we should be concerned about an actual war in the Taiwan Strait, because the cross-strait relationship is characterized by a number of different trends that are both complex and have kind of complex implications for the likelihood of conflict, but in many ways kind of contradict each other, right? And so it's hard to, like, different people come to different conclusions about the likelihood of conflict because they're basically weighing kind of different factors. Okay, so for instance, those who kind of point to a high or increasing likelihood of conflict often kind of emphasize in particular the rapid shift in the military balance of power in the Taiwan Strait in recent decades. And here I put up a slide that just kind of shows in crude terms kind of this dramatic relative increase in PRC capabilities in Taiwan Strait, just kind of looking at defense spending in China and how it compares to Taiwan over time. And defense spending for decades in real dollars has been pretty static in Taiwan, even as it's grown exponentially in the PRC. And even if you look at kind of less crude indicators, right, it's military experts are generally of the view that the military balance of power has shifted pretty in pretty important ways, and certainly there's growing concern among military analysts about the possibility that the PRC is approaching having the capacity to succeed in a conflict over Taiwan, if it's not there already. And so this is something that's potentially quite worrisome, given PRC claims to sovereignty over Taiwan, right? It potentially suggests that the PRC increasingly might view a military option as something that's kind of viable and that would succeed. And people also often point to kind of what they see as kind of a growing divergence in kind of the views of people in China versus Taiwan concerning the Taiwan issue. And here I've just kind of put up just a kind of a straightforward tracking poll that's done by National Zhengzhou University's Election Study Center in Taiwan, going back to the early 1990s, which just simply asks people, do you consider yourself Chinese? Do you consider yourself Taiwanese? Or do you consider yourself both Chinese and Taiwanese? And if you could kind of go back to the 1990s, most people said that they were either thought of themselves as Chinese or both Chinese and Taiwanese, right? And that the blue line is kind of solely Chinese, the kind of the pinkish line is both. But if we kind of look at the past 15 years or so, the percentage of respondents to this poll that kind of self-identify as solely Taiwanese has emerged as a clear majority of respondents that far overshadows kind of the percentage of respondents who identify in any way as Chinese, right? And this just kind of highlights the degree to which it seems like Taiwan is kind of, at least from a societal perspective, is kind of drifting away from Taiwan's orbit, right? And so again, if we're kind of thinking about the prospects for conflict, this could kind of give rise to thinking in Beijing that not only are China's military capabilities improving, and so there's a greater likelihood that it could succeed, right? But that ultimately time might not be on China's side, right? Because Taiwan might be kind of slipping away. And there are also kind of signs, right, coming from the leadership, right, that China might be becoming somewhat less patient on the Taiwan issue. And certainly if you look at some of Xi Jinping's rhetoric on Taiwan, it seems less patient than kind of the rhetoric of his immediate predecessors, right? So he's at multiple instances kind of suggested that this is not an issue that should be passed down to future generations. And he's kind of tied resolving Taiwan to kind of broader goals of China's national rejuvenation. Okay, and more broadly, there are studies out there, right, that kind of suggest that that there's quite a bit of hawkishness in Chinese public opinion, particularly about the Taiwan issue, right? And again, this could be something that all else equal kind of acts as a constraint on a Chinese leadership that might otherwise kind of want to pursue moderation against Taiwan. Okay, and so you have all these kind of factors that could kind of give someone who's kind of worried about the prospect of military conflict in Taiwan Strait more reason to worry. And certainly people who do worry a lot about this kind of point to these sorts of factors. Okay, but at the same time, right, we can point to a number of kind of stabilizing factors. And I think most clearly, we could kind of point to the large amount of economic integration that we see across the Taiwan Strait, right? And Taiwan's importance, right, as a producer of high-end chips and so forth to China's economy. Right. And so all else equal, right, the fact that there is such an extensive amount of economic exchange across the Taiwan Strait. So China is by far Taiwan's largest trading partner, right? And large amount of Taiwan investment historically has kind of flowed into the PRC. Right. This should be something that encourages caution and is stabilizing, right? Because it means that if a conflict were to occur, it would be incredibly costly. And the costs in Taiwan are obvious, but I think it's pretty clear that the costs in China would also be quite substantial of a large-scale military conflict. And it's not just kind of the cross-strait economic integration that we would look at. We'd also kind of want to look at kind of the degree to which China is integrated into global markets, right? And kind of think about kind of some of the ripple effects of a serious military conflict in Taiwan Strait for those broader economic ties, right? And so that's something that is stabilizing, right? And, even though if we kind of look at, some societal trends in Taiwan, right? We see kind of this growing sense of Taiwan-centric identity. There are other kind of features of Taiwan public opinion that suggest that that there's a lot of pragmatism among the Taiwan public. Right. And so this is another slide, and I apologize. I always kind of tell my students when I put this slide up in my classes, right, like do not put slides like this into your papers, right, because the whole point of kind of putting a chart up is to kind of simplify complex information. This does the opposite, right? So it's got like a bunch of like lines here, but I'll just kind of explain. Like, this is the same outfit that kind of does the previous slide that I put up with the Taiwan identity trends. But this is a poll that basically asks people about sovereignty issues, and it kind of gives people kind of a range of options to choose from unification right away to maintaining the status quo, moving toward unification later, to a couple different long-term status quo options. So maintaining the status quo, making a decision on unification or independence later, maintaining the status quo indefinitely, and then a couple of kind of lean independence options. So maintain the status quo, move toward independence later, and move toward independence as soon as possible. And I think that so there's been kind of some support and kind of long-term support for independence, right? And that's kind of the light green line that you kind of see going up, especially after 2019. And what's kind of going on there is I think a lot of that's in response to what was going on in Hong Kong at the time. But I think the most important kind of take-home point from this slide is if you kind of look at the top two lines, right, consistently over time, the top two responses in the survey have been the two long-term status quo responses. So either maintain the status quo for now and make a decision later about final sovereignty issues, or maintain the status quo indefinitely, right? And so this suggests to me that there's a lot of pragmatism among the Taiwan public, and there's not a lot of eagerness to move immediately toward independence or do something dramatic that might provoke a response from the PRC. Again, I think kind of reflecting a recognition that the cost of a cross-strait conflict would be incredibly high for Taiwan. Okay, so clearly there's a lot going on in the cross-strait relationship, and there's a lot of kind of factors that have both complex and contradictory kind of implications for the prospects for stability in the Taiwan Strait. And so the basic, like what I was hoping to do in this book project was to try to kind of think of how to kind of build a useful framework that we could kind of use to kind of think about conflict in a way that would kind of accommodate these different factors, right? And allow us to kind of think about how they interact with each other. Okay, and so broadly speaking, I grounded my approach in the bargaining and conflict literature in the international relations literature. And I begin in the book by essentially kind of noting that both China and Taiwan have kind of a mix of revisionist and status quo preferences relating to Taiwan. All right, and I think ultimately, as we'll see, that that's really important, right? So it's important not to kind of think of as one side as kind of being the status quo, state, and one side as being kind of the revisionist state. Both states are both status quo and revisionist, right? So China has a status quo goal of wanting to kind of stop what it sees as moves by Taiwan toward independence. Okay, but clearly Xi Jinping has kind of articulated, and leaders previous to him have articulated a strong interest in accomplishing national unification. Okay, and in Taiwan, right, there's kind of a clear, interest in avoiding kind of being coerced into unification, which is very much kind of a status quo preference, right? But there's also kind of a widespread sentiment in Taiwan that Taiwan, at a minimum, should be afforded more international space, right? And this is kind of something like across the partisan spectrum, that there's a view that Taiwan, whatever you want to call it, should have access to international institutions, right, and so forth. And many in Taiwan, if given kind of an ideal scenario, would like to see formal independence, and that's clearly very much kind of a revisionist preference. Okay, and so both sides have kind of this mix of revisionist and status quo preferences. And what this kind of implies ultimately is that there's kind of two broad kind of pathways to conflict in the Taiwan Strait, right? That we really need to kind of take seriously when thinking about the prospects for conflict, right? One kind of involving efforts by Taiwan to kind of realize its revisionist preferences, right? And so this would be kind of a conflict kind of rooted in actual or potential efforts by Taiwan to formalize independence, or to kind of effectively preclude unification as a viable future scenario. Okay, and on the Chinese side, right, like you can imagine kind of a conflict rooted in Chinese revisionism, where conflict would be rooted in efforts by the PRC to realize its own highly revisionist preference of kind of achieving formal unification with Taiwan. Okay, so to kind of think through these possibilities, I develop a very kind of stylized model of the cross-strait relationship. And again, this draws very much from bargaining theory. And I kind of conceptualize kind of the key issue that's in dispute here, that the two sides are kind of bargaining over, is Taiwan's sovereignty, or Taiwan's sovereign status, right? And I think of that status as lying on a continuum, ranging from formal unification with the PRC, or the U end of the continuum on one end, to formal independence, or the I end of the continuum on the other. And obviously, you can kind of think of China's ideal outcome as kind of lying closer to the U end of the continuum. In Taiwan, as I kind of note this in the book and talk about some implications, obviously it's more contested, right, what the ideal point is, right? But for simplicity, I think it's fair to assume that Taiwan's ideal point lies kind of closer to the independence end of the continuum. Okay, and we could kind of think of a status quo as lying somewhere in the middle of this continuum, right? So Taiwan, of course, enjoys de facto independence and autonomy, and it in many ways functions as an independent state, right? But obviously it lacks international legal recognition and so forth, right? And so the status quo is somewhere kind of in between these two extremes. Okay, and we could kind of imagine that if a war were to occur in the Taiwan Strait, that this would lead to kind of some new status quo, right? Some new outcome in terms of kind of Taiwan's sovereign status. And here I've just kind of arbitrarily kind of put it on the continuum to the left of the status quo and label this point W for the kind of the war outcome. Okay, and you could kind of think of the war outcome in two ways, right? So you could kind of think of it as, right, the two sides kind of start, become involved in some sort of military competition, and then they reach a new understanding, right? Like essentially either an explicitly negotiated or implicitly negotiated outcome, right? That maybe in this kind of context, Taiwan kind of backs off of kind of sovereignty claims a little bit, right? And so you could kind of think of it as kind of a bargained outcome, right? After kind of fighting a war. Or you could think of it more in probabilistic terms, right? So you could kind of think of like, if there's a conflict, the PRC will prevail and impose its preferred solution of unification with some probability. And the higher that probability, the closer the war outcome lies to the U end of the continuum. Okay, now the actual utility that the two sides get from the war outcome is not going to be W, right? Because war would be a horrifically costly endeavor in the Taiwan Strait. Lives would be lost. There would be a tremendous amount of kind of collateral economic damage and so on, right? And those costs are naturally going to detract from the utility of the war outcome for both sides, right? And so you could kind of think of Taiwan's war utility as not residing at kind of point W, but it's lying kind of further away from Taiwan's ideal point of independence at a point that, again, I've kind of arbitrarily labeled point T on this continuum. And you could kind of think of China's war utility as lying, again, kind of not at point W, but kind of further away from China's ideal point of unification, again, at a point that I've kind of arbitrarily kind of labeled point R on this continuum. And the reason why I've labeled it point R is you could basically kind of think of this point as China's reversion point or its red line. Okay, so this is kind of the point at which China is indifferent between initiating a conflict, right, to try to achieve unification or accepting some version of a status quo. Right. And so as long as kind of the status quo resides to the left of point R, China's kind of getting a better utility from that outcome than it would get by initiating a war. Right. But if we kind of get into a world where the status quo resides to the right of R, then the PRC feels that it could get a better outcome if it starts a conflict. Okay, and so then in the book, right, I try to kind of think about, well, how could we get into this world where the status quo essentially kind of resides to the right of R, right, in this framework? And again, I kind of think of this kind of through the lens of kind of two broad pathways, right? And so the first is, again, kind of this idea of kind of a conflict rooted in what might be termed Taiwan revisionism. Okay, so Taiwanese efforts to kind of reframe the status quo, right? Either by kind of moving toward a more independent Taiwan or by kind of essentially precluding unification as a future option. Okay, so one possibility of kind of how war could emerge in this kind of a scenario, right, a Taiwan revisionist scenario, is where you have essentially what you might term a revisionist Taiwan government crossing PRC red line, so crossing the point R in this kind of schema, relating to Taiwan's status, thereby triggering a military response. So it's very straightforward. And in the 1990s and 2000s, I think arguably many analysts kind of considered this the most likely path to conflict in the Taiwan Strait, right? And what were they worried about? They were worried about things that, for instance, the Lee Teng-hui and Chen Shui-bian administrations were doing, right? So Lee taking concrete steps to raise Taiwan's international profile in the 1990s. Here he is visiting his alma mater, Cornell University, in 1995, kind of triggering a long-running crisis in the Taiwan Strait in 1995 to 1996. You could kind of look at kind of some of the statements that leaders in Taiwan have made concerning the cross-strait relationship and Taiwan's status, right? So Lee kind of redefining the cross-strait relationship as one that's state-to-state or at least special state-to-state. Chen Shui-bian describing the Taiwan Strait as each side of the Taiwan Strait being a separate country, 一边一国. Right, and Tsai, right, even kind of using this rhetoric of Taiwan being an independent country, but calling itself the Republic of China-Taiwan. Okay, and then especially during the Chen Shui-bian administration, you saw kind of conscious efforts by the government to, if you will, kind of de-Sinify Taiwan, right, to highlight Taiwan's otherness from China, to kind of highlight its Taiwanese-ness rather than its Chinese-ness, right? And this took a number of forms. Changing the names of state entities, adding Taiwan to the cover of the ROC passport in English, downplaying the legacy of Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan, right? Chiang's, not only because he was a dictator, but also because his goal was to achieve national reunification, right? And so on the right here, I've kind of put up a picture of kind of what the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall looked like in the later stages of the Chen Shui-bian presidency, right? The honor guard had been removed, lights had been turned off, kites were hung from the ceiling, kind of obscuring the view of the statue of Chiang Kai-shek. Okay, and so a number of kind of steps were taken to kind of to highlight Taiwan's otherness from China during the Chen administration. Okay, and so you could kind of think of these efforts kind of collectively as an effort to kind of redefine the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, kind of in the direction of kind of a more formalized kind of conceptualization of Taiwan's independence, right? And so again, kind of coming back to this simple kind of stylistic model, right? You could kind of think of it as, war occurring in this scenario, because the status quo is kind of pushed across R. Okay, now, clearly no leader would actually want to push so far, right, that they would actually cross China's red line and trigger an actual military response from China, right? Because the war outcome, even if you kind of go back to the 90s and early 2000s, was terrible for Taiwan. That the PRC already had tremendous kind of capacity to impose high costs on Taiwan, right? And so no leader would kind of purposely trigger a military conflict from China, right? So I argue in the book that ultimately the scenario was kind of rooted in an underlying information problem, right? Where simply put, it was hard for Taiwan's leaders, and it still is hard to know exactly where China's red lines are, right? It's hard to know exactly what China would tolerate in terms of these various kind of symbolic and more concrete kind of actions that Taiwan was taken to kind of change how it kind of thought of its sovereign identity, right? Okay, and so given that, right, you could imagine kind of a scenario where Taiwanese leaders essentially miscalculate and kind of push further than Chinese leaders were willing to tolerate. I argue in the book, though, that in this kind of basic kind of version of kind of what I term a red line conflict scenario, or kind of a Taiwan revisionist scenario, that several factors kind of over time have helped to kind of mitigate the likelihood of this kind of specific dynamic kind of triggering a conflict, right? One kind of obvious thing is that a war is getting unambiguously more costly for Taiwan as kind of time moves along, right? And the most obvious reason for this is because of the PRC's rapidly growing military capabilities, right? And so the PRC can impose tremendous costs on Taiwan, right? Even if there's questions as to whether the PRC can actually occupy and hold Taiwan, right? It certainly can impose high costs on Taiwan if it wants to, right? And so that this in turn kind of gives reason for Taiwan's leaders to tread cautiously around China's red lines. And I think that since Chen Shui-bian, certainly under Tsai, we've seen that, right? Furthermore, China's been quite effective. So even though it's hard for China to kind of signal the precise location of its red lines, kind of what specifically it will tolerate, it's made pretty clear that there are things that Taiwan could do that would certainly go too far on sovereignty issues, right? So, things that look like a declaration of independence, like I think it's widely recognized in the United States and in Taiwan, right, that these would risk a serious military response from China. Okay, and so China's been pretty effective at signaling to Taiwan that it's serious about using military force if Taiwan pushes too far on these issues. Okay, and a final point that I think is worth emphasizing is that at a certain point, right, further gains on sovereignty issues in Taiwan, and this isn't to downplay the importance of symbolic gains, right? But they tend to be intangible and symbolic, right? And because Taiwan already is kind of functionally independent, right, and enjoys, like, it has its own elections and so forth, right? It has its own functioning government. Like further kind of steps in the direction of independence are largely symbolic, right, and involve kind of international recognition and so forth, right? And so I argue in the book that that this kind of again incentivizes some level of caution in Taiwan because it means that Taiwan is risking concrete costs for the pursuit of mostly kind of symbolic gains. Okay, but I argue in the book that kind of a more worrisome kind of version of a Taiwan revisionism conflict kind of lurks, even as this kind of obvious manifestation kind of may be kind of declining in likelihood. And this kind of more worrisome kind of underlying kind of source of kind of how a Taiwan revisionist conflict could manifest is ultimately rooted in the PRC fear that Taiwan might be slipping away for good, right? And this kind of fear is rooted in a number of trends that I kind of highlighted earlier that the PRC views as being kind of unfavorable, right? Things like kind of social trends in Taiwan, where you see kind of more and more identification with kind of Taiwan and not China, right? Things like the reality that the DPP has now won 3 presidential elections in a row in Taiwan. And things like kind of a deepening U.S.-Taiwan security relationship, right? And concerns about deepening security ties with Taiwan among U.S. allies, including most notably Japan and so forth, right? And how these trends are kind of affecting kind of the long-term possibility of ever accomplishing unification, right? And to the degree that these trends exist, it could kind of conclude, it could lead to kind of a conclusion in Beijing that Taiwan is essentially slipping away, right? And that it's important to act sooner rather than later to prevent that from happening. Okay, but I argue in the book that, so I think this is a real possibility. It's something that the United States especially needs to tread very cautiously around, and we could talk a little bit more about that later. But I do argue that there are still reasons to be kind of, cautiously optimistic about kind of avoiding this sort of a scenario, right? And most importantly here is that the trends in the Taiwan Strait are not all bad from Beijing's perspective, right? And so there are some very worrisome trends from Beijing's perspective, but on the same token, right, you have a rapidly shifting balance of military power, right? You have continued pragmatism among Taiwan's public. Right now, the election, it's kind of like a glass half full kind of situation for Beijing, right? So the DPP won the presidency again, but the KMT, did better than it's done in recent election cycles at the national level, and it recaptured the legislature and so forth, right? And so Beijing does have kind of some continued reason to remain patient, I think, on the Taiwan issue. And furthermore, there's kind of this, right, like even though I think this problem exists, right, there's still this kind of issue where, like, unless Beijing is confident that it could actually invade and occupy Taiwan, right, it's not clear that using military force to try to arrest some of these trends would actually work, right? And in fact, use of military force beyond kind of these gray zone, and even probably including some of these gray zone operations that the PRC has been conducting, right, risk backfiring by reinforcing some of the trends that Beijing views as unfavorable. Right. And so use of military force is likely to kind of reinforce kind of a sense of Taiwan-centric identity, right? It's going to lead to backlash against the PRC and probably the KMT in Taiwan and so forth. Okay. And so unless the PRC is confident that use of military force would actually resolve the Taiwan issue, right, it's not clear that kind of concerns about kind of future Taiwan revisionism actually incentivize initiating a military conflict in the Taiwan Strait. Okay, and then in the book, I also kind of think about kind of the flip side, right? And this is, I think, where kind of public opinion is now, right? Like where the policy world is, certainly in the United States, is kind of thinking about kind of conflict rooted not in Taiwan revisionism, right? But in kind of the PRC's own very kind of revisionist goals with respect to Taiwan, right? And here, right, it's pretty clear that it certainly, if we kind of look at kind of surface trends, like Beijing's war utility on the Taiwan Strait is probably improving. Okay, and I say it's not certain, right, because it's hard to know what's going on inside Xi Jinping's head, right? There are other trends like the continued kind of high level of economic integration and so forth, right? But certainly the shifting balance of military power in the Taiwan Strait is probably leading to a view that a war outcome is becoming more favorable from China's perspective. Okay, and to the extent that's true, right, what it implies, if we kind of go back to this kind of very simple kind of stylized model, is it implies that R is moving to the left, right? Because it implies that W is moving left and it's kind of pulling R with it, right? And so when we're kind of thinking about kind of a war occurring as a result of PRC revisionism, right, we're not thinking so much about kind of how could we be in a world where the status quo moves to the right across China's reversion points, right, the red line. We're thinking about a world where what happens if China's red line kind of moves to the left of the status quo. Okay, and so once the red line, of course, does move, or China's reversion point, its point R, kind of does move to the left of the status quo, right? We move again into a world where China prefers to initiate a conflict rather than accept a continuation of that status quo, right? Once R is left of the status quo, right, China gets a better utility from that war outcome than it gets from the status quo. Okay, now war would obviously be costly for Taiwan, right? And it's kind of and a number of scholars, including most famously, I think John Mearsheimer, have kind of observed, right, that China's war utility probably is improving, right, over time, right? And the point that they make, right, and Mearsheimer has kind of made this point kind of most explicitly in his kind of, his article from 10 years ago in the National Interest, right, Say Goodbye to Taiwan, arguably most provocatively kind of saying it, that that the solution to this is for Taiwan to begin accommodating, right? Because it would be terrible for Taiwan for there to be a war, and Taiwan knows this, right? And so in this article, Mearsheimer is basically arguing that over the long term, what's probably going to happen is Taiwan's going to become more and more like Hong Kong, right? It's gonna have to accommodate great power realities and just accept that it's going to have to allow the status quo to move to the left as China's red line kind of shifts to the left. Okay, but I argue in the book that I actually think that Taiwanese accommodation of these realities is really unlikely. And that if we kind of get to a point where China's red line actually is shifting to the left of the status quo, it's highly unlikely that China would accommodate this reality by moving the status quo further toward China's kind of ideal point. And there are kind of several reasons for this, right? One is kind of, obviously, it's really hard for the PRC to kind of credibly signal that its red line is shifting to the left of the status quo, right? That the PRC has lived with a functionally independent Taiwan for many decades now, right? Without initiating military conflict. And so it's really hard for the PRC to kind of signal that at some point, it's not going to accept this anymore, and it's going to be willing to kind of initiate military conflict, right? So there's a basic information and kind of signaling problem. Okay, there's a political problem in Taiwan in that there's very little support in Taiwan for really accommodating the PRC on sovereignty issues, right? And so kind of the PRC's kind of preferred solution of one country, two systems is something that's a complete non-starter among the Taiwan public. It has very little support. But even if you kind of look back at kind of efforts by kind of, leaders in Taiwan, such as Ma Ying-jeou, like when, Ma as president kind of broached the idea of a possible peace agreement with the PRC, he got enormous political pushback for doing that. And it was widely seen as being kind of a major political blunder, right? And so I think it would be really hard for a Taiwanese president to just politically to significantly accommodate the PRC on sovereignty-related issues. Some symbolic stuff is possible, right? But not kind of really concrete stuff where Taiwan appears to be kind of sacrificing some of its sovereign status. There are a number of really serious, I think, credible commitment problems that emerge if we get into a world where Taiwan starts kind of thinking about bargaining away some of its status. And I think most importantly here, to the degree that Taiwan starts to concede on sovereignty issues today, it kind of undermines potentially Taiwan's future bargaining power with China. And I think the most straightforward way that this dynamic happens, right, is vis-a-vis the United States, right? So if you're kind of sitting in Washington and you're kind of advocating for selling arms to Taiwan and maintaining a robust regional defense posture and getting Japan on board with kind of viewing the Taiwan Strait as an important kind of security issue and an important thing, that the US and Japan should be kind of coordinating about, right? And you kind of observe that there's a president in Taiwan that's kind of bargaining away some of Taiwan's status, and Taiwan seems to be kind of moving toward a one country, two systems solution over the long term, right? Like it's going to mean that you're going to be thinking like, well, should the US really be selling weapons to Taiwan, right? If Taiwan seems to be moving toward accommodation with the PRC, and what's the point, right, of engaging in robust deterrence on this issue if Taiwan doesn't seem to be all in on it, right? And so it's really a dangerous game for Taiwan to play, right, in its relationship with the United States if it starts to kind of appear too accommodating with the PRC. Okay, and so these kind of credible commitment problems are likely to loom large and make it difficult for Taiwan to accommodate the PRC. Okay, and more generally, people tend to be resistant to bargaining away things that they already have, right? This is an insight from prospect theory, and Taiwan's public overwhelmingly views Taiwan, or whatever you want to call it, the ROC, as being a sovereign and independent state, right? And so kind of moving away from that kind of status quo is something that I think most people would interpret as being kind of something that Taiwan's kind of giving away something that they already have. And people tend to be more willing to take risks to protect what they already think that they have. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that I think that if we ever get into a world where the PRC believes that it could achieve unification using military force at acceptable cost, that it would be really, really hard to find a peaceful way out of that. Okay, and so the key is to avoid getting to that point in the future, right? I think these problems that I just outlined would make it really difficult for some sort of accommodation to be reached to avoid the war outcome in that sort of a scenario. Okay, and I offer kind of a few, like, I think kind of consistent with kind of others, right? Kind of suggestions for kind of how to think about managing these risks. I think from the U.S. standpoint, right? I think it's really important that when thinking about deterrence, that people not forget the importance of reassurance, right? And the reason for this is that, yes, deterrence is really important. It's really important for the PRC to believe that use of military force would be very, very costly for China, right? And so the U.S. I think needs to invest heavily in deterrence in the Taiwan Strait, but it's also important to reassure the PRC that there's a status quo out there that the PRC can live with. Okay, and so how does the U.S. reassure the PRC? It does things like continuing to embrace a one China policy, right? Don't kind of back away from kind of ambiguity on Taiwan's status and these sorts of things, right? So it doesn't look like that the United States is kind of basically precluding unification as a possible kind of future scenario. And more broadly, I think it's also important to kind of recognize that this kind of movement of the U.S.-China relationship to much more of kind of a competitive, like adversarial relationship is potentially destabilizing for the Taiwan Strait, because I think it potentially undercuts kind of some of the benefits that the PRC gets from the status quo, right? It reduces essentially kind of the PRC stake in a stable status quo, especially if we start talking about things like decoupling, right? And then the dramatic kind of scaling back of kind of U.S.-China economic linkages, right? It basically means that some of the expected costs that the PRC would pay in a war in the Taiwan Strait are being front-loaded and are occurring now, right? And so the PRC doesn't have to kind of think about those costs anymore in the context of a conflict. Okay, so I'll go ahead and stop there. So that's just kind of a quick overview of some of the arguments that I make in the book, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Scott. I think that's really to the force. Your model obviously highlights the complexity of this issue, and I also like your policy implications towards the end. I guess what we're going to do is that Dash and Professor Paul and I will each ask a couple of questions, and then we'll also encourage our audience here to raise questions. You can type your questions in the chat room, right? So I will go ahead and ask a couple of questions. So I think in the earlier part of your presentation, you mentioned, both sides, PRC and Taiwan, have two sets of preferences, right? Status quo preference and revisionist preferences. Obviously, if the two sides operate based on their revisionist impulses, that's really a recipe for war, right? So we should get rid of those revisionist approaches. So the question here is that, so the starting point should be the status quo. Although the two sides define status quo differently, but I wonder, is there any overlapping area for the status quo? You put it in the middle, but not exactly the middle, the point. But I hope it's an area, right, from where they can operate. So is there any overlapping area in terms of the status quo, even if they have different definitions?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, Zhichen. Yeah, and I think you're right. Like, I mean, I think you have to kind of draw a distinction between kind of like facts on the ground, right, status quo, right, versus kind of like framing, right, and kind of policy and kind of the way that the two sides kind of conceptualize kind of Taiwan's rightful status, right, and so the PRC certainly has kind of a view of the status quo is that Taiwan is part of China, right? That's the one China principle, right? Is that there only is one China in the world, and Taiwan is a part of that China, right? And the PRC government's is the only legitimate government of that China, right? And so that's kind of a stated kind of version of the status quo that's very much incompatible with how most people in Taiwan kind of think about the current status quo, and it's incompatible with the U.S. One China policy, right? Which does not kind of endorse or accept this idea that Taiwan is a part of China. Okay, so I think it's important to kind of draw a distinction between that, right, and the large gaps that exist between kind of the principled stances that different parties kind of take, and it's contested as well in Taiwan, obviously, but versus kind of facts on the ground, right? Like everyone can agree that the PRC does not currently govern Taiwan, right? Like that's plain as day, right? And you don't need a principled, so you can have a principled kind of stance that's at odds with a principled stance in Taiwan, right? But you can kind of have a version of, you could kind of be thinking kind of more pragmatically about the status quo, right? As kind of reflecting a set of facts on the ground. And so I guess that's how I would answer your question.
Yeah.
So I think there can be overlap, even if there's like, in terms of kind of principled stances, there's more limited overlap.
Yeah. Yeah, obviously it's difficult for the PRC to officially recognize ROC. That's just
no,
impossible.
It will never happen. It will never happen.
Right. Yeah, but the point is that you talk about this, one country, two systems as a model. It's not popular in Taiwan. So why doesn't Taiwanese government, with the support of Taiwanese public, come up with a practical model, not an independent Taiwan model, but something that is likely to be accepted by Beijing. But the Taiwanese are not interested in doing that. So my point is that we should avoid war. We should not resort to revisionist approaches, but we should operate from the middle point, the status quo. But my perception here is that the Taiwanese are not interested in, seeking.
No, I think you're right. Like most people they're not interested in reunification. You could see it with the polls, right? The KMT doesn't, like most people in the KMT, like maybe as a long-term solution, there's still some kind of interest, right? Among the deep blue. But very few people want, like in the foreseeable future, reunification with the PRC for any number of reasons, right? And so that's part of what makes this a dangerous issue.
The future relations between the PRC and Taiwan doesn't have to be the so-called reunification. There are different options. I think we need to step out of this box, as if China would definitely want to control Taiwan, use force if necessary. I don't think that's the only option. To form a loosely kind of association, a confederation, that's also a possibility. Why people think that the China will use force to impose this unification on Taiwan? I think that's something the DPP government would love to use as a propaganda against the PRC to brainwash young people in Taiwan. Anyway, we can debate on this anyway. I do have another question here. So, because obviously we all believe that the war is not going to work. It's disastrous for all sides involved. You briefly mentioned the United States. Okay, so I wonder what kind of role does the United States play here? In terms of not just preventing war. Looks like all the U.S. policy now is based on deterrence, preventing PRC from attacking Taiwan using force. But that's just part of the story. The other side of the story, a solution, is diplomacy. What has the United States done to promote peace, reconciliation across the two sides, other than just arming, weaponizing Taiwan? What do you think the United States can do more constructively?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. Like what can the US do that's more constructive? I think you're right that, I kind of view recent US policy as pretty reactive. And I argue elsewhere that I think that there's, and some other scholars have kind of made similar arguments that a lot of what we see in the Taiwan Strait, like US-China interactions in the Taiwan Strait in recent years, I think resemble a worsening security dilemma where like the US government, I think, kind of views what it's doing as reacting to an increasingly coercive posture by the PRC, right? As manifest in a number of kind of concrete dimensions, right? Like, so you could look at the gray zone, operations. You could look at the military incursions. You could look at the rhetoric, the kind of shifting statements about like the less reassuring rhetoric to Taiwan, right? And the fact that the PRC has invested very, very heavily in a Taiwan kind of contingency in its military modernization program, right? And efforts to kind of pressure, for instance, international corporations on the Taiwan issue. And we can kind of go on and on and on, picking off Taiwan's diplomatic. So there's I think in the United States, right, there's kind of a view that US policy is reacting to a growing kind of PRC coercive posture against Taiwan, right? But you see the same thing in China, right? Where my reading of a lot of kind of the way that Chinese experts on Taiwan kind of think about what China is doing is also as reacting to events on the ground in Taiwan, right? What the DPP governments have been doing since 2016, but also kind of more importantly, kind of reacting to what they see as a deepening U.S.-Taiwan security relationship, right? And so both sides kind of see what they're doing as reacting to efforts by the other side to alter a status quo, and that's dangerous, right? And so I would just kind of say, like, I think it's something that happens on both sides, and I don't think it's on the U.S. side. I mean, there are people who are like, it's complex, right? And people have different motivations for why they care about Taiwan, but I think a lot of the motivation is kind of a sincere belief that that the PRC has kind of become more coercive in its posture toward Taiwan. That's kind of a long-winded response to your question. I'm not sure if I really answered it the way you were looking for.
Okay, Scott. Darshan, you have some questions, right?
Thank you, Scott. First of all, it was a very comprehensive discussion of a very, very, very complex situation, which you have very successfully outlined for us. I think the danger that we have, this is my personal opinion, the danger that we have in Taiwan Straits is not just because of Taiwan and the mainland China. If you just let those two entities be themselves and work or not work with each other for a foreseeable amount of time, I still believe something good could come up. And that's because, having lived in Taiwan for 7 years, I felt deeply the profound Chinese civilization that's inside Taiwan. Not just among average people, among everyone, how they treat the Chinese civilization, and so on. So, if we somehow can take the United States out of this picture and let Taiwan and China speak to each other in their own language, with the Chinese civilization on their backs, in talking to each other, I have a feeling that something could come out. Unfortunately, for the last 70 years, the United States have played a role, a profound role, in steering or guiding, if you like the word, Taiwan's movement. I mean, the fact that the United States, on the one hand, recognized the so-called quote-unquote one China, and on the other hand, providing military. In fact, one United States official just recently suggested that every Chinese family should have an AK-47, so that it will be an all people's war with China. It is hard to believe that United States has the best of intention in Taiwan and not see it as another step towards something to downgrade China's growth, just like Ukraine to be the step towards downgrading Russia's growth. You said very little about the role of United States in the discussion. Surely you don't believe that that is the case.
No, yeah, sorry. Like in the book, I have like a chapter that like that's one of the kind of the key trends. I didn't talk about that here, is kind of the shifting US-Taiwan security relationship. And
sorry, but even
Yeah.
in the book, that was not a main point. I read your book. There was a side issue in the book. The main point is you're talking about China and Taiwan directly confronting each other, or showing the data of how Chinese or Taiwanese do not regard themselves as Chinese and so on. But you never took out the American role. You never put in the American role in the discussion, and then make the assumption that suppose you take the American role out, what could happen?
Yeah, no, I mean, I disagree, Dasha, and I did think about that. Again, it was.
Oh, I'm sure you do. Yeah.
I had 4 chapters, right, that talk about trends, and one of them was about the US. The way I kind of conceptualize in terms of the model, like you're right, like ideally it would be like a 3-player model, right, where the US is directly incorporated. It complicates it. I don't think that it, like the benefit, right, and to be clear, it's like I don't formalize the model, right, in the book. It's stylistic and meant just to kind of illustrate kind of key points that I'm making. And so I think kind of adding the US as a kind of a player just like massively complicates things. And so what I do is I kind of conceptualize US support as kind of affecting the parameters of the model, right? And so I'm not ignoring kind of the US role. I'm just kind of thinking, I'm thinking of it in terms of kind of the parameters in the model rather than the US as being an actor. And I realize that that's a huge simplification, right? But it's just kind of a way of kind of digging in and kind of thinking about, and I do kind of think about the implications of more or less kind of US support for Taiwan and kind of what different US policies mean. And I come back to it in the conclusions with kind of, recommendations for the United States, like the ones I just kind of made briefly in the talk. So I disagree. Like I do think, like in the book, I do kind of spend a considerable amount of time kind of thinking about the role of the US. I mean, you might disagree with kind of the way I kind of conceptualize kind of the role and so forth, but I do think about that. So I'm also like, I'm somewhat, I want to kind of just push back a little bit, right? Like, and kind of thinking about kind of like the way you're kind of describing US intentions. I think you're right that there are some in the United States that kind of conceptualize Taiwan in the way that you're describing, right? Like you're basically kind of describing it as kind of like basically a pawn, right? This is kind of like an argument that you see a lot in China, certainly, and certainly kind of in the Pan Blue camp in Taiwan as well, right? That the United States is kind of basically manipulating Taiwan to achieve some sort of kind of strategic gain in its relationship with China, right? And the Taiwan issue is kind of secondary, and it's and the value that the US places in Taiwan is purely kind of subordinate to these kind of broader goals that the United States has in terms of kind of competition with China. And I don't deny that there are certainly people that hold that view in the United States. But I think it's important to note that I think that there's a pretty broad kind of spectrum of kind of rationales for kind of why people in the United States care about Taiwan, right? And certainly some of it is strategic, right? And it's kind of, you know, within the context of kind of broader U.S.-China rivalry, right? But I think it's I do think you have to take into account that there are a lot of people who sincerely think about the fact that Taiwan is a democracy, right? And this is important, and they're kind of thinking about things from kind of a human rights perspective. And if you just kind of look at like kind of support for Taiwan in the U.S. Congress, right? That like that's a motivator for a number of people who have kind of been outspoken in supporting Taiwan. It's not the only motivator, right? But I just kind of, I think it's important to note that there are kind of a range of different reasons for why people in the U.S. care about Taiwan. And it's not just to use Taiwan as kind of strategic leverage against China.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. I think, Darshan, if you agree, we have a lot of questions actually in the chat room, maybe
Yes,
we can
please.
pick
Go
some
ahead.
questions from, yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, so this question also actually, I also have a similar question here because recently, Scott, as you know, seems to be a movement in the United States among some scholars, and now also involving Biden administration officials that is challenging the UN resolution 2758, right? Basically, it's about Taiwan's status. They correctly point out that the resolution does not mention the word Taiwan, but of course, in that context, everybody understands that in that context, this is really about who is representing China? Is it PRC or the Chiang Kai-shek's government, right? So I just wonder why there's such a recent movement, in challenging the UN resolution 2785. You as a scholar, right? And especially now in this delicate moment, before Taiwan's transfer of power, May 20th. So what's the implication of this?
I think it's totally reactive. It's totally reactive to the PRC making more of an issue of this. That's my interpretation, right? And so I think that the PRC has kind of been pushing like an interpretation of this resolution. And you look at kind of joint like statements that have come out in response to like Pelosi's visit and so forth. And so I think it's reactive to what the PRC is doing. That's just my hunch. I don't think it's
okay. But the problem is they are using this to kind of justify U.S. support for Taiwan's meaningful participation in UN affiliated organizations, so WHO, right? But of course, Taiwan participated in WHO under President Ma Ying-jeou. So I think the U.S. government should ask the Taiwanese side, why, Taiwan was able to participate when Ma was in power. Why DPP cannot do it? So the problem is not on the mainland side, I would argue. So I don't think it's it's justifiable to challenge this UN resolution and in the name of helping Taiwan to participate in meaningful participation in international activities. I mean, the fact is Taiwan was able to do it before. So this is not
by accommodating
to the PRC,
right, in a way that's like highly contentious in Taiwan. So Jirshan, I don't want to get into like I don't want to kind of get into a debate about kind of who's right and who's wrong in these kind of issues. I'll just kind of note that there's a huge disconnect, right, between the United States and the PRC, like both, and this kind of goes back to the Obama administration and continuing through the Trump administration and continuing through the Biden administration concerning like how U.S. officials evaluate the Tsai administration and her posture toward mainland China versus how Beijing evaluates her, right? It's a huge chasm in terms of kind of how the two sides kind of think. So very different from like if you go back to Chen Shui-bian, right? There was kind of a shared understanding increasingly, like especially after 2003, in the Bush White House, and in Hu Jintao's China, right, that Chen was basically a revisionist leader, right? And there was kind of shared criticism of a lot of the things that he was doing, and there was pressure put on him by the United States in response to some of those things that he was doing, right? Like, for instance, right, he requested stopovers in prime cities like San Francisco and New York. And later in his second term, he was denied that, right? And he was told, well, you could stop over in Anchorage, right? And so there was very, and U.S. officials were, Bush himself, even in Chen's first term, but then later, right, you had high-ranking officials, including Condoleezza Rice, who were very outspoken in their criticism of some of the things that Chen was doing. Okay, and so there was very much, to some degree, the United States and the PRC were on the same page in terms of how they evaluated some of the things that the Chen government was doing, especially some of the identity politics, the UN referenda, and so forth. That is not the case under the Tsai administration, right? And so, unlike under Chen, you have a huge divergence in kind of how Tsai is viewed between the United States and China, right? And I think there's a number of reasons for this, right? Including the fact that the U.S.-China relationship is on less solid ground than it was in the early 2000s, right? But more generally, I think that there's a sincere view in Washington that Tsai is a very different leader from Chen Shui-bian, right? And has been more pragmatic and less provocative, and so so I think that that's kind of at root here, right? Is that that there are just big differences between the United States and China in terms of kind of how the Tsai administration is evaluated, right? And I think that when we kind of look at kind of the intensifying kind of hostility across the Taiwan Strait, there's a tendency in Washington to kind of say, well, Tsai is much more pragmatic than Chen, right? She's probably about as pragmatic as you can expect to get from the Democratic Progressive Party, right? And Taiwan's a democracy, right? Right. And so you've got one of its major political parties, and you have a leader of that party that's adopting, I think it's reasonable to say, like, kind of at the, at the far moderate kind of end of the spectrum of kind of what you might expect from that party. And I think that that's recognized and appreciated in Washington, right? And so, so there's a big kind of chasm in terms of kind of where the blame lies, right? In terms of the deterioration in the cross-strait relationship.
Yeah, I agree with you, Scott. I think, yes, from Washington's perspective, Tsai's approach is obviously more moderate, less confrontational, but still that doesn't meet the Beijing's expectation, right? Yeah. But I want to go back to because there's a question here about the U.S. military industrial complex, So I just wonder, because the so-called U.S. One China policy actually has been evolving, right? I remember when I studied the U.S.-China relations years ago, initially U.S. One China policy is based on three joint communique with PRC and Taiwan Relations Act. Actually, in that order, the three communique are before the TRA. But now, gradually, they moved to change the order, Taiwan Relations Act, then the three communiques. Now, in more recent years, they added the 6 assurances. And in that order, TRA and 3 communiques and 6 assurances. So the United States has shifted its interpretation of One China and its China policy. So I wonder, combining this question from the chat room, who is really making the U.S. policy towards Taiwan? Multiple choices. 1, U.S. Congress. 2, the White House. 3, Taiwan lobby. 4, the military-industrial complex. What do you think?
Well, I mean, like, I think I don't think it's one or the other. Like, ultimately, it's the White House that's going to make the final decisions, but it's under like a range of, right? I mean, it's a pluralistic society, right? And so you're going to have a range of voices that are going to impact decisions, and you can't just ignore like what the prevailing view in Congress is, right? Yeah, like, I mean, clearly there is a military industrial complex that has that has certain interests. Yeah. So I mean, I don't know that the Taiwan lobby is that powerful anymore, but yeah, I like it's a pluralistic process, and so I think it's a little bit it's difficult to kind of pinpoint like a specific kind of causal factor, right? Other than like it reflects kind of a range of things, and I think kind of underlying them also are kind of changes in the strategic environment.
Okay. So here's another question about the Taiwan's chip industry. So how important is Taiwan's chip making capability to US support for Taiwan? If manufacturing of sophisticated chips were diversified or moved to the United States or Europe, would the United States feel less compelled to support Taiwan?
It's a good question, and I don't know what the final answer is. So I think that like if I were to hazard a guess, I would say that it's like Taiwan's centrality in the global economy is an important factor. Is it the primary factor? I would say probably not. I think that there is broader, like kind of coming back to kind of some of the earlier questions, right? Like, I mean, certainly there's kind of a geostrategic rationale for US interest in Taiwan. Certainly, I believe that for many in the United States, and again, we're talking about pluralistic society, for many in Congress, right, Taiwan's domestic political institutions matter, right? And so there are other factors, right, that influence US interest in Taiwan. But yeah, like if the chip centrality goes away, then all else equal, I think it's less critical. It's also worrisome. I think that's actually a major kind of stabilizing factor, right? That really clarifies a lot of people's minds about just how horrible a cross-strait war would be, right? Because it would have massive global economic consequences.
Thank you, Scott. There's another question here, very interesting. PRC's official policy, of course, towards Taiwan is official model is one country, two systems, and of course, it depends on how we define one country. Can we say today the status quo across Taiwan Strait is either one country, two systems, or two countries, two systems? What do you think? What is the status quo exactly? Or I don't want to like push you to represent the U.S. government. What is the U.S. view of Taiwan's status exactly under its
the U.S. view is
policy?
that the U.S. view is it's undetermined, right? And the U.S. position is not to take a view like a position concerning final status issues, right? And clearly there's a lot of ambiguity in U.S. policy toward Taiwan. So that's the U.S. government view. Like if you're talking about kind of what's the status quo, again, I think you just have to make a distinction between kind of the status quo in terms of kind of principle, right? And so in principle, do we think of Taiwan as a sovereign independent country, right? That would be the DPP position. Or we could kind of think of the ROC as a sovereign independent country, right? And that would be the KMT position. Or we could think of the PRC government is the only legitimate government of China, and Taiwan is a part of that China. And that would be the PRC position, right? And so we have these different principal positions about what the status quo is, right? But there's also kind of like facts on the ground, right? And the facts on the ground, right, are that Taiwan is de facto a sovereign state, right? Regardless of kind of what your view is of the principled kind of situation, right? Where there is no consensus.
Okay,
I hope that answers the question. I think it's important to make a distinction between kind of objective reality and kind of principled views of that reality.
Right. So yeah, we have more questions here. Both the PRC and ROC are embedded with Chinese identity, which is practically bifurcated. Both are assessing the cost effectiveness of escalating conflict. it is in favor of perpetual unease, neither war nor peace. So basically, the question is about the status quo of across Taiwan Strait. How can the status quo be maintained if we don't, resort to revisionist approaches?
Yeah. So again, if we're kind of thinking of the status quo as like kind of the facts on the ground, so basically de facto sovereign, like let's just call it kind of a functioning independent government, even though it's not kind of internationally recognized and so forth, right? So kind of facts on the ground right now, but it's an evolving status quo. Like even if we're just kind of looking at objective reality, right? There's changes in how many countries recognize Taiwan. There's changes in kind of how much support the Taiwan gets from countries like the US or Japan and so forth. So it's not just kind of a rigid kind of fixed status quo. So is the question like, how do you preserve, like it's how do you preserve that kind of,
how the status quo can be preserved.
Yeah, well, I think that it's kind of a combination of kind of like a number of factors, but ultimately I think it's there's some credibility of like that it's a big question, and I'm kind of thinking in terms of kind of how do you avoid conflict, right, in the book, right? And I think that you can kind of say that preserving kind of some broad version, like keeping the status quo kind of within some kind of broad confines, I think is basically kind of how you avoid conflict, right? And so I think that kind of the answer to that question mirrors kind of my views that I expressed in the talk concerning like how best to kind of maintain some level of stability in the Taiwan Strait and avoid conflict, right? Because ultimately, it's large changes in the status quo that are worrisome, right? When kind of thinking about prospects for military conflict, either like changes in the status quo that are kind of leading toward kind of a greater level of kind of sovereign status for Taiwan, or the other way around, right? Anyway, so I think it kind of reverts to kind of some of the points I made in the talk. You need kind of robust deterrence, right, which combines kind of a credible capacity and willingness to intervene in a Taiwan contingency by the U.S., but also extensive reassurances that the U.S. isn't going to do things that the PRC considers intolerable, right? And so, hence the importance of kind of not doing provocative things on like One China and so forth, and not going scorched earth in the broader U.S.-China relationship, right? Which I think undercuts China's interest in stability in the Taiwan Strait.
Yes, thank you, Scott. We have a question from actually from the Dr. Joanna Lei in Taipei. Joanna, do you want to ask the question yourself, or should I read your question? Oh, yeah, here you are. Okay, Dr. Lei, please. Yeah, you're unmuted.
Unmute.
Yeah, unmute yourself, please.
Well, thank you so much for giving us a very clear outline in terms of how you perceive the independence and unification question. And I started from a point of view that many scholars in Taiwan believe that we now is on a time bomb or a ticking track because of a US strong involvement. So that's where I start from. But the second point I'm trying to make is if we reconsider your basic proposal, instead of a continuum that has unification and independence on both sides, if we look at it as an x-axis with unification and independence, and y-axis as war and peace, of course, the peace will be on the top. Then in this 4-quadrant diagram, we may redefine status quo as both de facto independent and de facto peace, because we didn't have a peace treaty across Taiwan Straits, but it's de facto peace. Because last time we had real hot war was 65 years ago. And once we make a 2-by-2 kind of analysis with 4 quadrants, then the role of the United States will be a lot more salient than the original one that you discussed. In the original one, the two players are Taiwan and PRC, and US will be in a supporting role. But if you look very carefully in terms of how we in Asia are discussing right now, in the fourth quadrant, the third quadrant, which is China pushing towards unification and the potential of a war, and that quadrant, US actually has a very strong position there, such as illustrated in the NDAA 2023 and 2024, in which United States identified China as a major competitor is a simple word, but a major adversary, and using Asian allies as potential ways to balance the relationship between the United States and China. So if you look at the war and peace quadrant, in that axis, US actually has a very strong role to play in our current situation. And I would argue, and I'd like to hear your comment, is that the reason why we are in such a short fuse, we were in de facto peace for 65 years. But the reason why we're in such a short fuse, and starting from 2019, we're being positioned as one of the most dangerous places on earth, is because US has taken a different perspective and have a different strategic interest in the West Pacific. And that's my question, and I'd like to hear your comment. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, and again, I think this comes back to kind of the point that I made earlier about like, my view is that there's a security dilemma between the US and China over Taiwan, right? And so I think it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem as to kind of identifying like who's, is it China, is it the United States that's kind of at root for kind of this kind of shift in equilibrium in terms of kind of level of kind of spiraling tension in the Taiwan Strait, right? I think that both sides are reacting to what they see going on in the other side, right? And the United States is reacting to any number of things about, what's going on in terms of Xi Jinping's China, both internally, in terms of its posture internationally, in terms of kind of its military actions in the Taiwan Strait, and so forth. And I think that Xi Jinping is in part reacting to what he sees as, and certainly you see this in terms of kind of Chinese Taiwan experts, right, kind of raising this in dialogues and so forth, that that there's kind of deep concern about what you just described, right, which is kind of what's seen as kind of a shift in US policy toward Taiwan, which you can see, right, in terms of, and I talk at length about this in the book, right, kind of signs of kind of shifts in the US-Taiwan security relationship over time. And I argue that, yes, there are clear signs that that there has been kind of a shift over time in recent years in US policy toward Taiwan. And so but I do think it's a little bit of a chicken and egg, and it's hard to really tease out how much of it is proactive and how much of it is reactive to what's going on in Xi Jinping's China.
Just one last comment. I see in your final comment saying that Taiwan needs to make certain moves so that it doesn't sort of push itself into a lesser advantageous strategic position. But if we reframe the question, instead of asking how we work in the unification and in the independence continuum, if we reframe the question and say how Taiwan can achieve peace or maintain peace, we may come up with different thoughts and may come up with different recommendations. So that's just, my final comments. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and I agree with that. I mean, that's like what motivated the book is a desire not just to kind of want to understand how to think about conflict, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is why, like, I don't think of it as like a two-dimensional space like you conceptualize, because I'm trying to think of conflict as kind of like the outcome that occurs as a consequence of kind of bargaining over like these other issues. But but I think, you know, the kind of two-dimensional space that you're kind of describing is intriguing, right? And I'd have to think more about it.
I
But
think it's a methodological tool.
yeah, but the motivation for the book certainly is like I want there not to be a war in the Taiwan Strait. So
Me too. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Joanna. Looks like we have quickly approached the 90-minute limit, right? Dashuan, do you have any final comments?
No, I don't have a comment, but I do like to invite my good friend Liu Rongsen, who is a very distinguished scholar in Taiwan. I think I like to hear more Taiwanese perspective. We heard Joanna's perspective. I'd like to hear Dr. Liu. Are you still there, Rongsen? Maybe.
Yeah, I'm still here, except I don't feel I'm qualified to make comment because I actually absent for most of the period of time. Although this topic is definitely not new here and elsewhere globally. So I think the plain truth is, I think the previous speaker said, this is the security as far as the market is concerned, which means China is threatening美国的霸权. So this is a reality. And Taiwan actually is just a pawn between two giants, two elephants. So I don't think Taiwan have much to decide her own fate. And also I have to point out that historically, there's only two solutions to solve the sovereignty problem. One is by trade. Okay, you offer price. If Trump may accept when he became president. Another option is by war. There's nothing in between. So to solve the Taiwan, is perhaps there are only two issues. Either by trade, offer a deal that both sides can accept, or by war. That's the lesson we learned historically. That's the true and brutal reality, I have to say. There's nothing in between. And the force, the power decide what's the fate. And unfortunately, Taiwan people have little say in the whole process. Unfortunately, that's my opinion. I hate to say that. Did you hear me?
Yes, very well. Any comments, Scott?
Yeah, my view is that, like, at the end of the day, right, this is like an issue that there's no good near-term solution, right, to the Taiwan issue, right? And ultimately, like, the best outcome, at least from my perspective, is to delay, like, trying to kind of box ourselves into a corner of kind of thinking that there needs to be a solution, right? And kind of hope that, like, in the future, more options will present themselves.
Well, I think we have come to the end, and it appears that we have not found a solution to the problem. I heard once that someone mentioned there is a solution. And the solution is for the People's Republic of China, or in Beijing, to just say that 1 Taiwan dollar equals to 1 renminbi. That means that the Taiwan people will all of a sudden become 30 times richer. And that will solve all problems.
Well, that's similar to what happened to Germany, East and West Germany.
Yeah. So, and it's actually interesting. I think it's almost true, and maybe it is true, that China can actually afford that. Even if it's not immediately, in the short, long term, China can easily afford that. And so, again, this is sort of a trading business type of solution, which Joanna has pointed out, there's a different quadrant to all these discussions. And maybe that's what these governments, both in Beijing and in Taipei, I think that for the Taipei government, it really is time for them to try to think of alternatives, because the way they are wanting to solve the problem now is, at the end of the day, it will be war. I don't see any way out of that. And I don't think they want it either. I think war is just not a preferable solution to any problem. As they always say, death is always the final solution. And it is frightening. And it is not just painful, but it is profoundly frightening. And we must do everything we can to prevent that. Now, maybe many Americans don't have a lot of friends in Taiwan. I have personal friends in Taiwan, like Liu. I don't want to see friends like Liu to get hurt, or Joanne to get hurt. I really don't. To me, that is deep personal reason for not wanting a war in Taiwan. And I think many of my American Chinese friends also have deep personal friends in Taiwan. In fact, I have relatives through my marriage having relatives in Taiwan, and I don't want them to be hurt either. So I hope that from today's discussion, while we don't find a solution, the arrow of direction, namely to prevent war, should be our ultimate and the only arrow of direction.
Well,
sorry.
I do offer a hope. If Trump were to be elected, he will trade with Xi Jinping. I give you back to Taiwan, and then China will fulfill all the debt which American own. That's one solution. I think it's a win-win to both China and USA.
Yeah, that was proposed over a decade ago in a New York Times op-ed.
This is what exactly I said called trade.
It's kind of a silly idea, but
no, it's not silly. World
I'm not
history.
So sure it's that silly. I'm not so sure it's that silly. It is probably not in the political science way, but it is the trading way.
That's exactly what I said.
Joanne, do you have any final comment?
No, I just thank you for a very sincere offer by Scott, and thank you for leading this discussion. We know that without a very strong US involvement, the fuse will not be this short. We're in a short fuse because US is actively involved. It's not intangible, it's tangible, especially in militarizing Taiwan. So I certainly hope that our wish to avoid war as the first preference under any circumstances can be clearly conveyed. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Zhu, your final comment.
Me? Well, nobody want or like war, but event happen is beyond anybody's expectation, such as Ukraine war with Russia, such as Israel war with Pakistan. No one predicted it happen. So when I'm saying that no one liked war to happen, but you never know.
Okay, so looks like we all may have different views, different interpretations of the status quo across Taiwan Strait, but I think that we do have a consensus here actually, that is to avoid war, right? I think that's something we all agree upon. That's good. I think that's the minimum success we have achieved so far, and we'll keep talking. We'll keep seeking solutions to this difficult problem. Maybe we'll never find a solution in the near future, but I think dialogues like this definitely are helpful to make people think, to look for other options other than war, right? I really appreciate Scott, your insight and your analysis of the situation and your perspectives on how we can approach this issue, maintain peace and avoid war. So that's all. Give Professor Scott Kastner a round of applause. Thank him for joining us. I think this is a great session, and I look forward to more sessions like this, more dialogues like this. Hopefully, we will be able to live in a more peaceful world. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, let me thank Zhichun and Dasha and everyone for attending. I really appreciate the chance to share this exchange. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Until next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you.